Welcome to Our College, Your Voices. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. Lynette Gonzalez from our Valparaiso campus is serving as the strategic rotation lead for Goal 6, which is the finance goal of our strategic plan. As a strategic rotation lead, Lynette presented the idea of a podcast about finance as a means of helping others at the college gain some of the knowledge that she's gotten about how the college is funded from the experience of being an SRL. So I'm excited to have Lynette and our CFO, Matt Hawkins, here with me today. So let's meet them. Hi, Lynette. Welcome to the show.
My name is Lynette Gonzalez. I am from the Valparaiso campus, and I am Department Chair for Humanities and General Studies.
Wonderful. And welcome to the show. And our other guest is Matt Hawkins. Hi, Matt.
Yes. Hello, Kara. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am from Indiana, from Winchester and Angola. I claim both of those small towns. I've worked in higher ed for pushing 20 years now. I was at Butler University, and then I came to Ivy Tech from 2010 to 13. And then I went to the Commission for Higher Education to be their CFO. Then I had a short stint at Ball State, and now I'm back at Ivy Tech for slightly over 3 years now.
You're what we call a boomerang here at Ivy Tech. You left and came back to us.
Yeah.
So, Lynette, I'd like to start with you and just tell us a little bit about what attracted you to become a strategic rotation lead. And then what did you think when the goal you got attached to was the finance goal? What was your first impression?
Panic. The strategic rotation lead was really interesting because there's so many components of the college that in academia, we don't, on the academic side, I should say, we do not see happening. And it was very attractive to me to see that there's finance and there's all the, satisfaction, plus, it's all the strategic goals. And I thought it was really important to know more. And then I signed in and got finance. I was like, oh my gosh, what do I know about finance? I know zilch. And it worked out to be an amazing experience because I learned so much background on how the college is run, how things are sorted out, to understand just the minute details of the college. It's really empowering, and it makes me want to make sure that everybody else has that opportunity. And with Ivy Tech being as transparent as it is about policy and function, I thought this was a great opportunity to bring that forward.
Absolutely. All right. So Lynette, you put together a list of questions, and I'll read those. You'll ask Matt some other questions, and really we're just going to make Matt talk for the next 30 minutes or so. So Matt, give us the broad overview of how the college is funded.
So a really broad overview would be that we have two funding sources predominantly. Those are state operating dollars and student tuition and fees. So state operating dollars make up about 55% of our budget, and the other tuition and fees make up about 45%. And our budget is about $507 million for fiscal year 21. The state portion of the budget is based on a performance funding model or an outcomes-based model. And those metrics are overall degree completion. So we're paid on overall degrees based on 2 3-year averages. So for fiscal 22 and 23 coming up in the budget session, they will use fiscal 14, 15, and 16 versus 16, 17, and 8 versus 17, 18, and 19. And they'll look at 2 3-year averages and pay us on the delta. So overall degree completion is one of the big metrics. At-risk degree completion is another metric that's based on Pell students. STEM degree completion, which is defined by the Commission. Student persistence, meaning when our students hit 15, 30, and 45 credit hours. And then on-time graduation rate. An on-time graduation rate is very important because it makes up 50% of the money. And that is first-time, full-time students that complete an associate degree within 2 years. So half of the money that the state is giving us is based on that. And the one note I would make about the state funding portion is that the state did cut all public higher education budgets by 7% during the current fiscal year that we're in. And 7% for Ivy Tech is about $17 million when you factor in the cut to our dual credit line item as well.
And that's actually a good segue into the next question, Matt, which is, I know there are some other special appropriations we receive, line items, those sorts of things. Can you talk just a little bit about those and specifically about dual credit?
So the dual credit really is our big line item. The others are very, very small and campus specific. Dual credit in 2011, I believe, the Commission did a study with all of the public institutions to determine how much it cost institutions to offer dual credit. At that point, they determined that if they gave the institutions $50 per credit hour and the institutions could charge up to $25, so it would be total $75 a credit hour, that would pay for the expenses at the institution. So Ivy Tech decided that it would not charge the $25 on top of the $50. So Ivy Tech has been receiving the $50 appropriation up until last fiscal year. So last fiscal year and during the last budget session, the state decided to hold the appropriation flat. So that equated to it being about $40 per credit hour for Ivy Tech. So while we received the same amount of money, we were receiving fewer dollars per credit hour because they kept the appropriation flat. So that is why you'll hear some questions about how that might be funded in the future, whether it be $50, which is what I assume the commission will have in its budget recommendation, or if it would be rolled into the base operating appropriation. We'll just have to work with the commission and General Assembly on that in the upcoming session.
Matt, I know you and I know this because we work through this, but we are at a critical time in budgets because we are going into a budget session is what I call it. I don't know if that's the specific name for it. Can you just talk a little bit about the difference between a biennial budget and an annual budget, which Indiana does a biennial?
So a biennial budget, and we just sometimes say biennium or budget session. Biennial budget is just that the state has a long session, what they call a long session, every 2 years, and they're setting the state budget for 2 years. And part of that state budget is for public higher education, which makes up about 12% of the overall budget. We're one of, I believe, only 16 states now that do a biennial budget. All of the other states do an annual budget. But there is a lot of work that goes into the budget process. So a lot of folks around here think that it's a good idea to stick with the biennial budget process. But all of the public institutions have to set a budget and pass a budget every year. So we do an annual budget, whereas the state budget is every 2 years.
And as you looked at the funding model for the college, we're about 45% tuition. Can you talk a little bit about how tuition is set?
So tuition by statute is set every 2 years. We have to hold a public hearing after the General Assembly is out. We have to do that within 60 days of the General Assembly and within 30 days of the commission making its budget recommendation and tuition recommendation. So the commission will come out and say, based on all of these different ratios and factors, we believe public higher education should increase tuition by no more than this percent. And then all of the public institutions have to determine what percent that is. And then as we set that for 2 years, then the state budget committee, which is made up of Democrats and Republicans and the state budget director, they can have questions about what rate we set, and then they will call either the president or the CFO of the institution in to explain why they increased their tuition by a certain rate. And at Ivy Tech, obviously, our tuition rate is lower than all the other public institutions. So if we increase our tuition rate by 1.65%, that's obviously a smaller dollar amount than the other institutions. So when we increased our tuition by 3% last time, we were called into the state budget committee to explain why we did that. So it is a 2-year process that is in statute.
But that increase in tuition still keeps us in the lower levels of tuition for a state institution. So is there a reason why we haven't attempted to increase that in greater amount? Even if we went up another 3%, we would still be quite low.
If you look over the past decade, Ivy Tech has increased its tuition and fees by well over 30%. So over the past many years, pre-2017, tuition was going up at a fairly steady rate. And during a couple of those biennia, Ivy Tech was raising its tuition every semester. So it was raising it essentially twice a year during the biennium. So we have raised tuition considerably over the past decade. And we've done so because if you look from 2011 to 2020, our FTE enrollment is down over 40%. So those tuition increases helped the revenue come in as enrollment was declining.
So we've looked at sort of the big picture on the state level. Let's zoom into Ivy Tech specifically for a little bit. What is the average cost to run a class? So
that is a very hard question because there are a lot of
I know it is.
There are a lot of variable costs that go into running a class. So if you just take the average mid-range faculty and benefits, which is about $76,500, and 5 classes in the fall, 5 classes in the spring, you come to about $7,600. If you take our tuition rate, which is $149.55, you come to $449 a class. So you're looking at about 17 students to pay for that class. But that doesn't include all of the cost to run the institution. So that doesn't include advising or facilities or insurance or unemployment or all of those things that are included in our federal indirect cost rate. So if you just take the cost of a class based on the faculty member times our indirect cost rate, which is 50% of salaries, you come closer to needing 26 students in the class. And our average is about 11 students in a class. So that's why on our financial statements, you can see that we have a very large operating loss every year. And that's where the state operating dollars fills in the gap for us. So without the state funding, we would obviously have to charge a much, much higher rate based on the number of students in the classes.
I know that we're trying to fill as many classes as we can in the various modalities that we've been given the opportunity to do so. Is there a push in any way to make sure that classes are capped at a certain way to make sure that they can pay for themselves?
That would be more of a Kara question.
So you've probably heard me say that we need to move to a more student-centered, data-informed schedule. And that is sort of a beginning of some research that we're doing. So the first research we're doing is around just it's just exciting research around what our course offering grid looks like. And the easiest way I can explain this is if you think about the different classes that you're offering as Legos, you need to use class lengths and the different times that actually fit together in the Legos. So if you're offering a 6-hour class, and then you could offer 2-hour classes within that, you could offer 3-hour classes within that, you could offer 1-hour classes within that. But if you start offering classes that are, say, 2.5 hours in length, then that leaves you with an hour of waste in that 6-hour block. And so it's trying to begin to analyze that pattern as well as student course taking patterns to see if we can optimize the schedule to try to improve that ratio of the number of students in each class.
So that's kind of at the point of to be determined what the number really needs to be.
Right. Right now it's campus determined. I don't know that will ever change, but we are certainly trying to arm the campuses with better data to make those decisions.
Okay.
All right, Matt. So while we're talking about tuition, let's talk about cash flow, which for those who don't do higher ed accounting, like traditional accounting terms don't really work in higher ed, or at least not in the way I did it. But can you explain the college's cash flow patterns?
Yeah, so you're really looking at revenue and expense when you're talking cash flow. And our revenue comes in what I would call lumpy. It comes in very heavy in July and November. And that's when students are signing up for fall and spring semesters, which make up over 80% of the tuition and fee revenue in fall and spring. Our expenses are a lot steadier over the year because it's predominantly salary and wage. So that's spread out more monthly. Then we have 2 very large expense months, which is January and July. And that's when we make our debt service payments. So that's essentially us making our mortgage payments, and then we invoice the state during that month. So we pay about $3 million a month for our debt service or our mortgages on our buildings.
And then, Matt, can you talk a little bit about sort of how you quantify what the college's total worth or value is at any given time?
Yeah, so this really goes back to your point about using different terminology because we follow GASB accounting principles. So we really talk in terms of net position. So when we do our financial statements, the first page in the financial statements with numbers on it is our net position. And that's just saying, is the college better or worse off because of the activities of the previous fiscal year? So if you look at our total net position, which is our assets minus our liabilities, it's just under $870 million. So that's about $1.2 billion in assets that we have, and then about $400 million in liabilities. The liabilities are, again, the mortgages or debt service that we talked about. And then the buildings in the asset portion are listed at about 622 million. And that is the building value minus accumulated depreciation. So accumulated depreciation is technically a contra asset. So you take the original value of the building plus the contra asset to come to the 622. So our buildings were originally worth $1 billion or so on our financial statements, and we have them listed at 622 because of accumulated depreciation. So 870 million is the answer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Our audience can't see that my eyes glazed over as you went into that, but you can. So
I was boring myself.
I really tried.
Here I am taking notes like a good little student.
I try. I try to hang in there with Matt, and every once in a while I'm just like, nope, I don't have it anymore. I lost it somewhere after I was done.
The mortgages, what kind of mortgages? I know that we lease spaces, especially for certain activities, like if welding or something, the buildings can handle it. But what are we doing for buildings that are, let's say, dilapidated, or the depreciation is so significant that building would actually be better not in our pocket? What are we doing about those? Is that how are we adjusting for those kinds of values?
So I would say that I don't think we have any dilapidated buildings at this point. And in Indiana, we are very lucky that the state pays us a portion for what they call R&R, repair and rehabilitation. So they look at our total building value and our infrastructure value, and they multiply that by 0.25% each year of the biennium. And they fund every public institution based on that. And depreciation is really not connected directly with the condition of the building. You would take a brand new building and you would depreciate it straight line over 20 years. So you're essentially spreading that expense over 20 years. And then on the financial statement, it will essentially have no value at the end of 20 years, but it could still be in very good condition and have a functional value for us. So the condition and the depreciation aren't really connected. But when we do have buildings that are in need of work or replacement, that's part of the biennial budget process where we go to the state and say, we need this building and this space for these reasons. So if you think about Muncie and Kokomo and Columbus most recently, we went to the legislature to say, we need these spaces for these reasons. And they said, we will agree to fund those. Then we issue debt and they make those mortgage payments, which is why our expenses are heavy in January and July.
So that was the information you gave me about the bonds and selling the bonds and making sure that that's secured. And that's when we're talking about the rating of the school. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
that's
cool.
why the rating is so important, because when we go to market, the state is not backing our debt because General Assemblies cannot bind future General Assemblies. So they're saying we will pay for your debt during these 2 years, but they could make a decision to say we cannot afford to pay for your debt. Therefore, it is yours. So to external rating agencies like S&P and Fitch, which is who we use, they look at us and say, you have to be responsible for all of this debt. And we have about $250 million in debt, which is why reserves and all of those ratios are so important to us, because when we issue new bonds, we want to get a very good rate for the state on those bonds. And we have to be able to pay it if something were to happen to a payment. And those rating agencies are obviously rating schools across the nation. So they're sensitive because many states have stopped paying on buildings after they said, you should have this building, but if they get in a financial position that they can't pay for it, they will stop payment. So many states, frankly, states very close to us have done that. And the reason Ivy Tech's reserves are even more sensitive is because we have so few revenue sources. Most other institutions, even community colleges, have local property taxes. So they have some taxing authority to raise revenue if they need to. And other institutions have housing and dining and auxiliary funding sources. We have two. And to the rating agencies, we almost have no control over either, because the state General Assembly determines 55% of our operating appropriation. And then technically our board sets our tuition rate, but obviously the state can be very heavy-handed if you do something it doesn't want you to do. So the state has a huge role to play in 100% of our funding.
So let's continue down that path with the ratings agencies, because Most people don't celebrate their S&P and Fitch rating, but we do because it's quite good. And there might have been some cocktails after the day that we found out how good it was. So, Matt, can you talk a little bit about what our status is, sort of how we got to where we are with them, how current it is, I guess is what I'm asking. And then I'll go a little bit more into what those ratings agencies do look at.
So our last rating was just a couple months ago, and we have what's a double A stable rating. So we are second to only IU and Purdue in higher ed public ratings in Indiana, which is amazing as a community college. And during COVID, there were hundreds of schools that their outlooks were changed. So all of the rating agencies gave higher education in general a negative outlook. So to keep a double A stable rating during COVID was a huge accomplishment. So the state of Indiana, IU, and Purdue all have a triple A rating. And the difference between ours and AAA is very slight. And it's just trying to determine over the next 20 years, how likely are you to be able to pay this debt back, or do we think you will have a default? So that's kind of the rating scale up and down. So between us and IU, we're a double A stable. The next rating up essentially is a double A with a positive outlook. And then you would go to a double A plus stable, then to a double A plus with a positive outlook, then to a triple A. So there is some distance between us and IU and Purdue, obviously because they have many more funding sources and levers to pull. So their state funding is closer to 10% of their budget, whereas ours is 55%. So just their revenue defensibility, as the rating agencies would call it, is stronger than ours. But it's very impressive that Ivy Tech has a double A stable, which is, again, the second highest of all of the publics. And I would say just really good fiscal stewardship over the past many, many, many years. I think every CFO we've had, we've had 3 over the past 20 years or so, they're just very focused on stability of the institution and stability in bad times and good. So if you're having good times, you really need to focus on the unknown and what could happen, because Ivy Tech specifically has to jump into action when something bad does happen, because our students are more vulnerable to those situations than other institutions. And you can't be making extremely drastic moves in your operations as the world is changing and you have to serve students. So that's why the reserves and the rating and all of those things are so important, because when you have a situation like just happened, you don't see Ivy Tech making extreme drastic moves. Like some of the private schools, one of their first moves was to not pay any retirement contributions for employees during the whole fiscal year, or do 10 or 20% salary cuts across the board. Those were kind of the first moves, because your major expense categories are, staff and benefits. That makes up between 60 and 70% of all of the budgets.
So Matt, I'm going to ask a question you might not want to answer, which is okay. You don't have to. But as we look at the college's finances in terms of COVID, there are certainly a few places, and you and I talk about this a lot, where we've saved what you would call a few dollars on utilities, on travel, those sorts of things. We've also had a lot of additional expenses. We've paid faculty and staff additional compensation, both for extra work done, as well as just to try to help them navigate the challenges of COVID. When you look at the next, this current biennium, the next biennium, how do things look from the college's financial perspective?
So we really couldn't be in a better position financially with regard to being able to be stable in the moment. So our reserves look fantastic. We're in a really good position now. My concern is the revenue shortfall over the next many years, and you can't predict what that will be. So as you know, Kara, you and I had a few texts today with just some of the unknowns at the state level. Right now, it's 7% cut this year, but what will the next 2 years look like? And that is dependent on tax revenue at the state. So we don't know what that looks like, and we really don't know what enrollment will look like. So both of the funding sources are under extreme pressure right now. So it's really hard to predict what it will look like, but having financial stability allows us to look at data and respond appropriately instead of having those pronounced reactions. And I would say in this moment, because I know there, salaries have been a question mark. So we did the $750 one-time payment, which is more than most of the other schools did. But I would say what we would have used for a salary increase, we took the first week of the fiscal year and we distributed that $6 million to campuses. And the reason we didn't do a salary increase, but we distributed it to campuses is because we wanted to stabilize operations during COVID. So there were so many unknowns that we wanted to just keep operations going. So it was more important to do that than to have a salary increase. So we did that, and the president did not want the state cut of $17 million to affect campuses. So she covered that entire portion of the state cut for this fiscal year. So those were really big, and I think just keeping the institution stable was very important. So I'm also happy that the 750 was a possibility to do during this very tough fiscal year.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, definitely. When you say that she was able to cover that, what do you mean? Does she have a special fund or funding bucket that she could use for that?
So that's a really good question. So over the past few years, I've been very reluctant to increase the investment income revenue budget. So we have investment incomes on any funds that we have, but we also have what's called a mark-to-market adjustment on the last day of the fiscal year. And essentially what that is we have to say, if we sold all of our investments today, what would that do? Would we lose money or make money? And over the past many, many years, that mark-to-market adjustment has been in the negative millions of dollars. So we budget $2.7 million of revenue based on our investments. And the past 2 years, because the environment has been so unstable, our very secure investments, which are predominantly treasuries and very high quality bonds, were worth more. So those mark-to-market adjustments were much higher. So last year, we made over $17 million more on our investments over budget than we budgeted. So we took that from last year and we put it in a restricted account, which we named the strategic reserve. And the first day of the fiscal year, we distributed over the campus budgets. So it was investment income that she then placed in a restricted account and then passed out to the campuses immediately. So it was covering the state cut. And then the $6 million, which would have been the salary increase, was distributed to campuses for all the reasons that campuses are very aware of right now related to enrollment and other financial needs that they have.
And that history of managing, and I always screw up the negatives and positives on this, but managing to that budget on investment is a part of that overall just stability type focus that our finance office has always had.
Yes. And I think specific, I can only speak directly for me. I tend to be a kind of nervous person. When I was at the state, one of the Senate analysts would, call me a nervous Nelly all the time. And I just kind of am. So I really need a pattern of something happening over many years before I want to change something like investment income revenue. Because if you increase the revenue budget and then the mark-to-market adjustment is more than you increase it, so you now have a negative budget, you have to cut somewhere. And when you cut, if you don't have any extra money around, it's coming from the entire system. So that would mean a decision point that one person made would affect the entire system. So that's why I've always been extremely cautious about the investment income revenue budget.
And you may have said this before, but what is our investment budget? I mean, what is the overall amount the school has invested into, like you said, treasury, that sort of thing?
So we have an investment policy which mirrors many of the other institutions. We use a company called Capital Cities in Indianapolis. And we basically have a 3-tiered structure, and it's based around our cash flow needs and what investments we want to make and for what duration. So we have what's called Tier 1 investments, which is essentially cash. So those are invested in bank accounts, really. That's FDIC insured and PDIF insured. So there's something called the Public Deposit Insurance Fund in Indiana, and there's no limit on what that insurance amount is. So I believe don't quote me on this, anyone, but I believe there's $3 billion in that fund at the state level. So if a bank defaulted on any of our deposits as an instrumentality of the state of Indiana, those would be covered. So it is more than FDIC. And our goal is to have $50 million in Tier 1. So over the past year and a half, I have been, again, very nervous about just the overall situation of higher ed. So I was keeping more cash in Tier 1 because we were making a good return in Tier 1 on our bank accounts before the Fed made its move recently. So we had a lot more in Tier 1 than other institutions. So if you heard of institutions taking out lines of credit for cash flow, the calculation they were making is basically saying it is cheaper for us to take a line of credit with a bank than to sell our investments before maturity. So we had enough in Tier 1 that we didn't have to make one of those decisions. So right now in Tier 1, we have $164 million on the goal of 50. In Tier 2, the goal is $30 million, and that is something that is between 1 and 3 years to maturity. So that's a little longer than just a bank account. Goal 30 million, we have 32 million in right now. Tier 3 is the remaining funds, and that's between 3 and 10 years in duration, or 3 up to 10 years. And that has no goal. It's just the remainder of funds available. And that has just over $416 million in it right now. So just over $600 million invested, and we have a $2.7 million revenue budget based on what we expect to receive from those investments. And anyone that's familiar with investing at all, they're going to say that you're making nothing on your money. What are you doing? So in the state of Indiana, there are restrictions in our Constitution on what an instrumentality of the state of Indiana can purchase. So we're very restricted on what we can buy. So our Tier 1 investments made 123 basis points last year, which is 1.23%. Our Tier 2 made 2.72%, and our Tier 3 made over 5%. So we had a really good year, which again is why the president was able to cover the state cut. But in some years, you'll make $8 or $9 million on your balance, but then your mark-to-market adjustment will be -5. So in years past, the investment income is X, and then you subtract the mark-to-market adjustment, and you hope that you're close to the revenue budget that you budgeted for your total portfolio. And fixed income is the word that my brain was searching for there. You're only allowed to purchase fixed income. And at Ivy Tech, we only purchase very high quality fixed income.
Right.
So if you look at the rating of the fixed income that we buy, it is AA and above. So it is essentially companies or municipalities that are less risky than even Ivy Tech.
So your financial, in your predecessor's financial conservancy has really put Ivy Tech in a really stable position financially. So like in the future, because one of the questions we always get, or I always hear is like, oh my gosh, are we going to be able to stay open? And, X, Y, Z, you know how it goes. And so it is kind of nice to hear that there is some solidity. We have a foundation.
Yes. And the only thing I would say about your sentence there is you said me, and it's really this huge group of people that I work with that are infinitely smarter than me. And I am taking their counsel and using the investment policy for what it's intended. So it is definitely not me. But yes, we are very financially stable at this moment.
And we have a wonderful finance team. Matt, you're a great leader, but we do have a fantastic team as well. So.
Yes, after working with them on SRL, they're amazing, just amazing.
Good.
Yeah.
So Matt, you talked a lot about investment. So we'll go to the sort of the last category of question, which is around endowment. So do we have an endowment? Because you talked about investments, but is that the same thing as what we hear when we hear like Harvard's endowment and IU's endowment?
No. So very literally, the college has an endowment, which is $64,000. Many, many other institutions have endowments, and those endowments make investment income, and they use those dollars to fund the institution. So when I was at Butler, which was 16 years ago at this point, they had a $100 million endowment, which is not large for a small institution like that, but they would spin off 5% or so of that endowment and the income, and they would use that as operating revenue and expense budget for the institution. So Harvard, all those other places, Notre Dame has a very large endowment. So they use those endowment dollars and the investment income off of those to fund the institution's operations, which is why when you see a downturn like you did, even though Notre Dame has $11 billion or so in endowment, they have a budget that is based off of what they had. So if that endowment loses 30% of its value, it changes the entire institution's operating budget. And everyone's knee-jerk reaction is, well, you have all of that money, just use some of that money. But a large portion of those endowments are restricted dollars. So you can't just choose what you do with the dollar. They're using what they would call the corpus, which is the interest off of those endowments to fund the institution. So we at Ivy Tech do not have one, which is not really rare for a community college. The Ivy Tech Foundation does have just under $40 million in restricted funds, but we don't use those dollars for operations at the institution. That mostly goes to student aid and things like that. And again, those are very restricted.
Okay. Can you give us a good definition of what endowment is? Several of those questions toward the end of the list that I gathered together were put together by business instructors, finance. I had no idea what I was looking at. I had to look it up in a dictionary. So can you give us a good definition of endowment, how that even works?
You know, I probably won't give an acceptable answer to the business faculty because I'm sure they know more about it than me. But very, very generally, it's essentially a perpetuating fund. So you're putting a dollar amount in a fund, and whatever it earns, you're doing something with that money, but the principal investment stays.
Okay.
So it's constant. Every year it's spinning off a certain amount of investment income, which you're spending.
And this is money brought like by alumni, things like that? Okay.
Yes. So their foundations bring in dollars, whether they're restricted or unrestricted, and they build up an endowment, and they're only spending the interest off of that.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think 40 minutes on finance is probably all most people can take. But as Lynette mentioned, she sent us a great list of questions. And so we're spinning that off into some other episodes about how the college works. So we love this kind of, audience participation. So Matt, I'm sure you're going to get called on again. I know Mary Jane Michalak has been called on to do an episode. So this won't be your last time on the show, my friend. But as a call to action, we end every episode with one of those. We'd love for you to, as faculty and staff, to ask questions like this about how the college operates. I'll give you several ways here in just a minute. You can send those in to me. And we'd love to put more shows together about this because I do think it's important. Matt and I live, eat, breathe, and sleep this stuff every day. And it becomes second nature to us. And we forget that everybody else doesn't have that understanding. So I think it's good to add that. So anything either of you want to add to this episode?
Just thank you.
Sure.
Thank you both for taking time to do this.
Yeah, of course.
And to be so proactive about it because there's such a gap in the knowledge base of what we have between the parts of the college. And that you take time and that you care enough to do it is wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for joining this episode of Our College, Your Voices. I want to thank the members of today's panel, Lynette Gonzalez, who's Associate Professor of Humanities at Valparaiso, and Matt Hawkins, who's the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer in Systems Office. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. You can connect with me on Twitter at KNM Tweets. You can reach us by email if you have some of those questions at ourcollegeyourvoices@ivytech.edu. You can also leave us a voicemail at 317-572-5049. Our website is www.ivytech.edu/podcast. Production assistance for this and every episode provided by Becky Campbell, Sarah Ferguson, and the Ivy Tech Community College Marketing and Creative Services team. And our podcast concept is by Matthew Pittman. Theme music and post-production services provided by Jen Eanes at the Brassy Broadcasting Company, and we will talk to you next time on Our College, Your Voices.